Thanks. Not very long ago, as you all recall, it was taken for granted that the Iraq War would be the central issue in the 2008 election, as it was in the midterm election 2 years ago. However, it's virtually disappeared off the radar screen, which has elicited some puzzlement among the punditry. Actually, the reason is not very obscure. It was cogently explained 40 years ago when the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam was in its 4th year, and the surge of that day was about to add another 100,000 troops to the 175,000 already there, while South Vietnam was being bombed to shreds at triple the level of the bombing of the North, and the war was expanding to the rest of Indochina. However, the war was not going very well, so the former hawks were shifting towards doubts. Among them, the distinguished historian Arthur Schlesinger, maybe the most distinguished historian of his generation, a Kennedy advisor, who he and Kennedy, other Kennedy liberals, were reluctantly beginning to shift from a dedication to victory to a more dovish position. And Schlesinger explained the reasons. He explained that, I'll quote him now, "Of course, we all pray that the hawks are right in thinking that the surge of that day will work, and if it does, we may all be saluting the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in winning a victory in a land that we have turned," he said, "to wreck and ruin. But the surge probably won't work at an acceptable cost to us, so perhaps strategy should be rethought." Well, the reasoning and the underlying attitudes carry over with almost no change to the critical commentary on the U.S. invasion of Iraq today. And it is a land of wreck and ruin. I've already heard a few words. I don't have to review the facts. The highly regarded British polling agency Oxford Research Bureau has just updated its estimate of deaths. Their new estimate a couple of days ago is 1.3 million. That's excluding 2 of the most violent provinces, Karbala and Anbar. On the side, it's kind of intriguing to observe the ferocity of the debate over the actual number of deaths. There's an assumption on the part of the hawks that if we only killed a couple of 100,000 people, it would be okay, so we shouldn't accept the higher estimates. You can go along with that if you like. Uncontroversially, there are over 2 million displaced within Iraq, thanks to the generosity of Jordan and Syria. The millions of refugees who have fled the wreckage of Iraq aren't totally wiped out. That includes most of the professional classes. But that welcome is fading because Jordan and Syria receive no support from the perpetrators of the crimes in Washington and London, and therefore they cannot accept that huge burden for very long. It's going to leave those 2.5 million refugees who fled in even more desperate straits. The sectarian warfare that was created by the invasion, nothing like that had ever existed before, that has devastated the country, as you know. Much of the country has been subjected to quite brutal ethnic cleansing and left in the hands of warlords and militias. That's the primary thrust of the current counterinsurgency strategy that's developed by the revered Lord Petraeus, I guess we should describe him, considering how the way he's treated. He won his fame by pacifying Mosul a couple of years ago. It's now the scene of some of the most extreme violence in the country. One of the most dedicated and informed journalists who has been immersed in the ongoing tragedy near Rosen, has just written an epitaph entitled "The Death of Iraq" in the very mainstream and quite important journal Current History. He writes that Iraq has been killed, never to rise again. The American occupation has been more disastrous than that of the Mongols, who sacked Baghdad in the 13th century, which has been the perception of many Iraqis as well. Only fools talk of solutions now, he went on. There is no solution. The only hope is that perhaps the damage can be contained. But Iraq is, in fact, a marginal issue. And the reasons are the traditional ones, the traditional reasoning and attitudes of the liberal doves, who all pray now, as they did 40 years ago, that the hawks will be right and that the U.S. will win a victory in this land of wreck and ruin. And they're either encouraged or silenced by the good news about Iraq. And there is good news. The U.S. occupying army in Iraq, euphemistically it's called the Multinational Force Iraq, because they have, I think, 3 poles there somewhere, the occupying army carries out extensive studies of popular attitudes. It's an important part of counterinsurgency or any form of domination. You want to know what your subjects are thinking. And it released a report last December. It was a study of focus groups, and it was uncharacteristically upbeat. The report concluded, I'll quote it, that the survey of focus groups provides very strong evidence that national reconciliation is possible and anticipated, contrary to what's being claimed. The survey found that a sense of optimistic possibility permeated all focus groups, and far more commonalities than differences are found among these seemingly diverse groups of Iraqis from all over the country and all walks of life. This discovery of shared beliefs among Iraqis throughout the country is good news, according to a military analysis of the results. Karen DeYoung reported in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago. Well, the shared beliefs are identified in the report. I'll quote DeYoung. Iraqis of all sectarian and ethnic groups believe that the U.S. military invasion is the primary root of the violent differences among them, and see the departure of what they call occupying forces as the key to national reconciliation. So those are the shared beliefs. According to Iraqis, then, there's hope of national reconciliation if the invaders, who are responsible for the internal violence and the other atrocities, if they withdraw and leave Iraq to Iraqis. That's pretty much the same as what's been found in earlier polls, so it's not all that surprising. Well, that's the good news, shared beliefs. The report didn't mention some other good news, so I'll add it. Iraqis, it appears, accept the highest values of Americans. That ought to be good news. Specifically, they accept the principles of the Nuremberg Tribunal that sentenced Nazi war criminals to hanging for such crimes as supporting aggression and preemptive war. It was the main charge against von Ribbentrop, for example, whose position was in the Nazi regime was that of Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. The tribunal defined aggression very straightforwardly. Aggression, in its words, is the invasion of its armed forces by one state of the territory of another state. That's simple. Obviously, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan are textbook examples of aggression. And the tribunal, as I'm sure you know, went on to characterize aggression as the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself all the accumulated evil of the whole. So everything that follows from the aggression is part of the evil of the aggression. Well, the good news from the U.S. military survey of focus groups is that Iraqis do accept the Nuremberg principles. They understand that sectarian violence and the other post-war horrors are contained within the supreme international crime committed by the invaders. I think they were not asked whether their acceptance of American values extends to the conclusion of Justice Robert Jackson, chief prosecutor for the United States at Nuremberg. He forcefully insisted that the tribunal would be mere farce if we do not apply the principles to ourselves. Well, needless to say, U.S. opinion, shared with the West generally, flatly rejects the lofty American values that were professed at Nuremberg, indeed regards them as bordering on obscene, as you could quickly discover if you try experimenting by suggesting that these values should be observed, as Iraqis insist. It's an interesting illustration of the reality, some of the reality that lies behind the famous clash of civilizations. Maybe not exactly the way we like to look at it. There was a poll a few days ago, really a major poll, just released, which found that 75% of Americans believe that U.S. foreign policy is driving the dissatisfaction with America abroad, and more than 60% believe that dislike of American values and of the American people are also to blame. Dissatisfaction is a kind of an understatement. The United States has become increasingly the most feared and often hated country in the world. Well, that perception is in fact incorrect. It's fed by propaganda. There's very little dislike of Americans in the world, shown by repeated polls, and the dissatisfaction, that is the hatred and the anger, they come from acceptance of American values, not rejection of them, and recognition that they're rejected by the U.S. government and by U.S. elites, which does lead to hatred and anger. There's other good news that's been reported by General Petraeus and Ambassador Ryan Crocker. That was during the extravaganza that was staged last September 11th. September 11th. Might ask why the timing? Well, a cynic might imagine that the timing was intended to insinuate the Bush-Cheney claims of links between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. They can't come out and say it straight out, so therefore you sort of insinuate it by devices like this. It's intended to indicate, as they used to say outright, but are now too embarrassed to say, except maybe Cheney, that by committing the supreme international crime, they were defending the world against terror, which in fact increased sevenfold as a result of the invasion, according to a recent analysis by terrorism specialists Peter Bergen and Paul Cruikshank. Petraeus and Crocker provided figures to explain the good news. The figures they provided on September 11th showed that the Iraqi government was greatly accelerating spending on reconstruction, which is good news indeed, and remained so until it was investigated by the Government Accountability Office, which found that the actual figure was 1/6 of what Petraeus and Crocker reported, and in fact a 50% decline from the previous year. Well, more good news is the decline in sectarian violence. That's attributable in part to the murderous ethnic cleansing that Iraqis blame on the invasion. The result of it is there are simply fewer people to kill, so sectarian violence declines. It's also attributable to the new counterinsurgency doctrine, Washington's decision to support the tribal groups that had already organized to drive out Iraqi al-Qaeda, to an increase in U.S. troops, and to the decision of the Sadr's Mahdi army to consolidate its gains, to stop direct fighting and work politically. That's what the press calls halting aggression by the Mahdi army. Notice that only Iraqis can commit aggression in Iraq, or Iranians, of course, but no one else. Well, it's possible that Petraeus' strategy may approach the success of the Russians in Chechnya, where, I'll quote the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, Chechnya, the fighting is now limited and sporadic, and Grozny is in the midst of a building boom after having been reduced to rubble by the Russian attack. Well, maybe someday Baghdad and Fallujah also will enjoy, continue the quote, electricity restored in many neighborhoods, new businesses opening, and the city's main streets repaved, as in booming Grozny. Possible, but dubious, in the light of the likely consequence of creating warlord armies that may be the seeds of even greater sectarian violence, adding to the accumulated evil of the aggression. Well, if Russians share the beliefs and attitudes of elite liberal intellectuals in the West, then they must be praising Putin's wisdom and statesmanship for his achievements in Chechnya. Formerly, they turned into a land of wreck and ruin and are now rebuilding. Great achievement. A few days ago, the New York Times, the military and Iraq expert of the New York Times, Michael Gordon, wrote a comprehensive review, first page comprehensive review of the options for Iraq that are being faced by the candidates. And he went through them in detail, described the pluses and minuses and so on, interviewing political leaders, candidates, experts, etc. There was one voice missing, Iraqis. Their preference is not rejected, rather it's not mentioned, and it seems that there was no notice of that fact, which makes sense because it's typical. It makes sense on the tacit assumption that underlies almost all discourse on international affairs. The tacit assumption, without which none of it makes any sense, is that we own the world. And so what does it matter what others think? They're unpeople, nice term invented by British diplomatic historian Michael Curtis. He's done a series of outstanding volumes on Britain's crimes of empire, outstanding work, therefore deeply hidden. So there are the unpeople out there, and then there are the owners, that's us, and we don't have to listen to the unpeople. That conception, that deeply rooted imperial mentality, we find everywhere we look, constantly. Just pick out a couple of examples, more or less at random, from the last few weeks. Last month, Panama declared a day of mourning to commemorate the U.S. invasion. It's under George Bush #1. It killed thousands of poor Panamanians when the U.S. bombed the El Chorrillo slums, other poor areas. So Panamanian human rights organizations claim. We don't actually know because we never count our crimes. Victors don't do that, only the defeated. It aroused no interest here. There's barely a mention of the day of mourning. There's also no interest in the fact that Bush I's invasion of Panama was a clear case of aggression to which the Nuremberg principles apply. And it was apparently more deadly, in fact, possibly much more deadly than Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait happened a few months later. But it makes sense that there would be no interest in that because we own the world and Saddam didn't. So the acts are quite different. It's also of no interest that at that time, of the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, the greatest fear in Washington was that Saddam would imitate what the United States had just done in Panama, namely install a client government and then leave. It's the main reason why Washington blocked diplomacy in quite interesting ways.
with almost complete media cooperation. There's actually one exception in the U.S. media. But none of this gets any commentary. However, it does merit a lead story a few days later, when the Panamanian National Assembly was opened by President Pedro Gonzalez, who's charged by Washington with killing 2 American soldiers during a protest against President Bush #1, against his visit 2 years after the invasion. The charges were dismissed by Panamanian courts, but they're upheld by the owner of the world, so he can't travel, and that got a story. Well, to take just one last illustration of the depth of the imperial mentality, New York Times correspondent Elaine Sciolino, veteran correspondent, writes that Iran's intransigence about nuclear enrichment appears to be defeating attempts by the rest of the world to curtail Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Well, the phrase "the rest of the world" is an interesting one. The rest of the world happens to exclude the vast majority of the world, namely the non-aligned movement, which forcefully endorses Iran's right to enrich uranium in accordance with the rights granted by its being a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But they're not part of the world, even though they're the large majority, because they don't reflexively accept U.S. orders, and commentary like that is unremarkable and unnoticed. You're part of the world if you do what we say, obviously. Otherwise, you're unpeople. Well, we might, since we're on Iran, might tarry for a moment, ask whether there's any solution to the U.S.-Iran confrontation over nuclear weapons, which is extremely dangerous. Here's one idea. First point, Iran should be permitted to develop nuclear energy, but not nuclear weapons, as the Non-Proliferation Treaty determines. A second point is that there should be a nuclear weapons-free zone in the entire region, Iran to Israel, including any U.S. forces that are present there. Actually, though it's never reported, the United States is committed to that position. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it appealed to a UN resolution, Resolution 687, which called upon Iraq to eliminate its weapons of mass destruction. That was the flimsy legal principle invoked to justify the invasion. And if you look at Resolution 687, you discover that one of its provisions is that the U.S. and other powers must work to develop a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East, including that entire region. So we're committed to it. And that's the second element of this proposal. The third element of the proposal is that the United States should accept the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a position which happens to be supported by 82% of Americans, namely that it should accept the requirement, in fact a legal requirement as the World Court determined, to make good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons altogether. And a fourth proposal is that the U.S. should turn to diplomacy, and it should end any threats against Iran. The threats are themselves crimes. They're in violation of the UN Charter, which bars the threat or use of force. Well, of course, these four proposals, again, Iran should have nuclear energy but not nuclear weapons. There should be a weapons-free zone throughout the region. The U.S. should accept the Non-Proliferation Treaty. There should be a turn to diplomacy and an end to threats. These are almost unmentionable in the United States. Not a single candidate would endorse any part of them, and they're never discussed, and so on. However, the proposals are not original. They happen to be the position of the overwhelming majority of the American population. And interestingly, that's also true in Iran. Roughly the same overwhelming majority accepts all of these proposals. But the results come from the world's most prestigious polling agency, but not reported as far as I could discover, and certainly not considered. If they were ever mentioned,
they would be dismissed with the phrase politically impossible, which is probably correct. It's only the position of the large majority of the population, kind of like national health care, but not of the people who count. So there are plenty of unpeople here too. In fact, the large majority. Americans share this property of being unpeople with most of the rest of the world. In fact, if the United States and Iran were functioning, not merely formal democracies, then this dangerous crisis might be readily resolved by a functioning democracy. I mean, one in which public opinion plays some role in determining policy, rather than being excluded, in fact unmentioned, because after all they're unpeople. Well, while we're on Iran, I guess I might as well turn to the third member of the famous axis of evil, North Korea. There is an official story, read it right now, is that the official story is this, that after having been compelled to accept an agreement on dismantling its nuclear weapons and the facilities, after having been compelled to agree to that, North Korea is again trying to evade its commitments its usual devious way. So the New York Times headline on this 10 days ago reads, United States sees stalling by North Korea on nuclear pact. And the article then details the charges of how North Korea is not going through with its responsibility. It's not releasing information that it's promised to release. If you read the story to the last paragraph, and that's always a good idea, that's where the interesting news usually is when you read a news story. But if you manage to get to the last paragraph, you discover that it's the United States that has backed down on the pledges made in the agreement. The United States had promised to provide 1 million tons of fuel, and what did I do? I couldn't see, I'm sorry.
10 minutes.
I should hurry up? Yeah, okay. All right, just start screaming at me if I go on too long. The U.S. just refused to supply it. It supplied only 85% of the fuel that it promised. And it was supposed to improve diplomatic relations, of course not doing that. Well, that's quite normal. You want to find out what's going on in the U.S.-North Korea nuclear standoff, it's better, you have to go to the specialist literature, which is uniform on it, nothing hidden, and in fact sort of sneaks out in the small print in the press reports, as I mentioned. What you find is that North Korea may be the most hideous state in the world, but that's not the point here. Its position has been pretty pragmatic. It's kind of tit for tat. The United States gets more aggressive, they get more aggressive. The United States moves towards diplomacy and negotiations, they do the same. So when President Bush came in, there was an agreement, it's called the Framework Agreement, that had been established in 1994. Neither the United States nor North Korea was quite living up to it, but it was more or less functioning. At that time, North Korea, under the Framework Agreement, had stopped any testing of long-range missiles. It had maybe 1 or 2 bombs worth of plutonium, and it was verifiably not making more. That was when George Bush entered the scene. And now it has 8 to 10 bombs, long-range missiles, and it's developing plutonium. And there's a reason. The Bush regime immediately moved to a very aggressive stance. The axis of evil speech was one example. Intelligence was released claiming that North Korea was was cheating, had clandestine programs. So it's rather interesting that these intelligence reports 5 years later have been quietly rescinded as probably inadequate. The reason, presumably, is that if an agreement is reached, there will be inspectors in North Korea, and they'll find that this intelligence had as much validity as the claims about Iraq, so they're being withdrawn. Well, North Korea responded to all of this by ratcheting up its missile and weapons development. In September 2005, under pressure, the United States did agree to negotiations, and there was an outcome. September 2005, North Korea agreed to abandon, quoting, all nuclear weapons and existing weapons programs.
and to allow international inspection. That would be in return for international aid, mainly from the United States, and a non-aggression pledge from the U.S., and an agreement that the two sides, I'm quoting, would respect each other's sovereignty, exist peacefully together, and take steps to normalize relations. Well, the United States, the Bush administration, had an instant reaction. It instantly renewed the threat of force. It froze North Korean funds and foreign banks. It disbanded the consortium that was supposed to meet to provide North Korea with a light water reactor. So North Korea returned to its weapons and missile development, carried out a weapons test, and confrontation escalated. Well, again, under international pressure and with its foreign policy collapsing, Washington returned to negotiations that led to an agreement which Washington is now scuttling. There's an earlier history, an interesting one. You recall a couple of weeks ago there was a mysterious Israeli bombing in northern Syria, never explained, but it sort of hinted that this had something to do with Syria building nuclear facilities with the help of North Korea. It's pretty unlikely, but whether it's true or not, there's an interesting background which wasn't mentioned. In 1993, Israel and North Korea were on the verge of an agreement in which Israel would recognize North Korea, and in return, North Korea would agree to terminate any weapons-related, missile, nuclear, or other, any weapons-related activity in the Middle East. That would have been an enormous boon to Israel's security, but the owner of the world stepped in. Clinton ordered them to refuse. And of course, you have to listen to the master's voice. So that ended that. And it may be that there are North Korean activities in the Middle East that we don't know about. Well, let me finally return to the first member of the axis of evil, Iraq. Washington does have expectations, and they're explicit. They're outlined in a declaration of principles that was agreed upon, if you can call it that, between the United States and the U.S.-backed, U.S.-installed Iraqi government under military occupation. The two of them issued the Declaration of Principles. It allows U.S. forces to remain indefinitely in Iraq in order to deter foreign aggression. Well, the only aggression in sight is from the United States, but that's not aggression by definition. And also to facilitate and encourage the flow of foreign investments in Iraq, especially American investments. I'm quoting. That's an unusually brazen expression of imperial will. Actually, it was heightened a few days ago when George Bush issued another one of his signing statements declaring that he will reject crucial provisions of congressional legislation that he had just signed, including the provision that forbids spending taxpayer money, I'm quoting, to establish any military installation or base for the purpose of providing for the permanent stationing of U.S. armed forces in Iraq, or to exercise U.S. control of the oil resources of Iraq. Okay? Shortly after, the New York Times reported that Washington insists, if you own the world, you insists that the Baghdad government give the United States broad authority to conduct combat operations, a demand that faces a potential buzzsaw of opposition from Iraq with its deep sensitivities about being seen as a dependent state. It's supposed to be more third world irrationality. So in brief, the United States is now insisting that Iraq must agree to allow permanent U.S. military installations, grant the United States the right to conduct combat operations freely, and to guarantee U.S. control over the oil resources of Iraq. Okay, it's all very explicit on the table. It's kind of interesting that these reports do not elicit any reflection on the reasons why the United States invaded Iraq. You've heard those reasons offered, but they were dismissed with ridicule. Now they're openly conceded to be accurate, but not eliciting any retraction or even any reflection. Well, there's a lot more to say about good news, but I was told to shut up, so I will. Just say that thinking about these things really does give some insight into the famous clash of civilizations and its actual substance, topics that really ought to be foremost in our minds, I believe. Thanks.
So thank you to Professor Chomsky. We're now going to open it up to a question and answer period. We have 2 mics at either end of the stage on the floor. If people who want to ask a question can line up, please, and we'll hopefully get as many of your questions in as we can.
Professor Chomsky, I just want to thank you for coming. And I wanted to ask you, I lost the train of thought that you were developing initially, and that was that there was a comparison historically with Vietnam and how the war wasn't going well to the modern time now with what's happening with Iraq. And I was just going to ask you to pick up that that train of thought that you're saying there was as things turned badly in Vietnam, and you were going to make a parallel to the current thing that was happening in Iraq, and I was just going to ask you to.
Well, the position of the liberal doves in the case of Vietnam was very much like what Schlesinger described. He put it eloquently. We all pray that the hawks will be right, that by increasing the level of violence we'll win, even if we leave a land of wreck and ruin. Doesn't matter much. And if they win, we'll be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of our leaders, but it's costing us too much, so it's probably not going to work. So therefore, we should look for another strategy. As one other one, at the end of the war, 1975, Anthony Lewis, it was about at the critical, as far to the critical end of the media as you can discover, reviewed the war. He said that the United States began with blundering efforts to do good. He didn't have to say that because that's a tautology. Whatever action the Holy State undertakes is efforts to do good. Blundering, if it costs too much, that's probably historical universal. So it began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969, he said, namely about a year after the business community turned against the war because it was too costly, by 1969, it was clear that it was a disaster, which was costing us too much. So therefore, we have to oppose it. This is maybe not a nice thing to say, but it's true, so if you don't mind, I'll say it. This is exactly the reasoning of Nazi generals after Stalingrad. It was the right idea, but Hitler made a dumb mistake. They should have gotten rid of England before he invaded Russia, or the other way around. So it's costing us too much, so now we're doves. That carries over. You can read, every time you open a newspaper or a journal, that's what you read. The hawks say, if we keep increasing the level of violence, we'll win. The doves say, we all pray that you're right, but it's not going to work. And therefore, when it seems that the violence is being reduced, for the reasons I mentioned, the hawks are jubilant, and the doves either are quiet, or they try to say, well, it's not really working. But of course, if it did work, we'd be praising your wisdom and statesmanship. That's the general attitude of intellectual elites. It's not the attitude of the population. So in 1969, when the first polls were finally taken, about 70% of the American population described the Vietnam War as not a mistake, but fundamentally wrong and immoral. And those figures have remained up until the most recent studies, I think the last early 2000. That's the unpeople.
the people who matter, the smart ones, the educated ones, their position is pretty much like Arthur Schlesinger's. I should say to Schlesinger, another comment about Schlesinger, when in the case of the Iraq War, he's about the only person that I can find among liberal intellectual elites who condemned the war on principled grounds. When the bombing of Iraq started, right away, the first day, he wrote an article in which he said that the day of the bombing of Iraq, he said, is a date which will live in infamy, quoting Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the day of Pearl Harbor, a date which will live in infamy as the United States follows the policies of fascist Japan. That was Arthur Schlesinger this time, but you don't see that mentioned. Take a look at the obituaries, not that. His principled opposition to a war of aggression is unmentionable. His unprincipled opposition as a liberal dove, that's hailed. That's a comment about ourselves, not the population, but the elite intellectual sectors that we ought to take pretty seriously. I mean, maybe, suppose that Petraeus' strategy works and the United States succeeds in doing what the Russians did in Chechnya. I mean, do we praise Putin for having destroyed Chechnya and now beginning to rebuild it? No? Do we praise him for the fact that they now have electricity and there's a building boom in Grozny after they turned it to rubble? I don't see that anywhere. With regard to others, we can keep to elementary moral principles. When we're talking about ourselves, it's not only unimaginable, it's considered outrageous. I mean, it elicits horror and tantrums. It's an interesting fact about the reigning intellectual culture, and again, it's not just true of the United States, it's true throughout history. Doesn't mean it has to be true or that we should tolerate it. Does that get at what you were asking? Yeah. I only see one microphone. Oh, okay.
Can you talk about the terms of the deal that Iran offered us shortly after 9/11, where they offered us everything we're now asking for, and we subsequently...
I'm sorry, I can't hear. Maybe stand a little back from the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just wondering if you could talk about the terms of the deal that Iran offered us shortly after 9/11, where they offered us everything we're now asking for, and we refused it, subsequently denied it. Yeah.
It was not right after 9/11. They were making moves even before that. But the major one, I think the one you're referring to, was in early 2003, when the Khatami government, the moderate Iranian government, offered the United States, actually we now have the exact offer. You can find it on the Washington Post website, so no question about it. They offered the United States discussion, negotiations on all outstanding issues, all nuclear issues, on recognition of Israel, everything. That offer, the U.S. doesn't have formal relations with Iran, we refuse to, so the offer was brought to Washington by the Swiss emissary, who's the mediator between Iran and the United States. The Bush administration received the offer and responded. Namely, they censured the Swiss emissary for bringing it. Okay, that was the end of that one. Nevertheless, Iran proceeded. In 2004, Iran and the European Union entered into negotiations, and Iran agreed, rather surprisingly in my view, but they agreed to suspend uranium enrichment, which they're legally entitled to do, as the unpeople of the world recognize. They suspended uranium enrichment during the negotiations, and they wanted a quid pro quo, that the European Union should do something. And what they asked them to do was to end threats of force and violence against Iran. Okay? Well, the European Union couldn't do that because the owner of the world in Washington wouldn't permit it. So after a couple of years of negotiations and failure of the United States of the European Union to provide security guarantees, Iran withdrew and returned to enriching uranium.
read the reports of that, and you'll see, okay, you can't trust the Iranians, they're back defying the world again. But that's what happened. And the options could be pursued today. The positions that I read, which I think are pretty sensible, those proposals, happen to be the opinion of the overwhelming majority of people in both the United States and Iran. And they would probably end the crisis, at least mitigate it. But of course, the people who take these positions in the United States, probably each person who answers in a poll must think, I'm the only person in the country who thinks these crazy things. They've certainly never read it anywhere. They never see it anywhere. The polls, when they come up with results like that, as they regularly do, are just not reported. If these were matters of discussion, I think the percentage would not be like 75%, it would probably be like 90%. Okay, but that's one of the reasons why you have to keep from discussing it.
Yes, Professor. I just wanted to see if we could turn our attention to a different tentacle of imperial power, and that's south of the border in Chiapas and also in Oaxaca, Mexico, where I personally just returned from a trip to Chiapas, and what I was hearing before and then and since then is that the Zapatista and autonomous movement is facing a severe increase in paramilitary and military attack, and there's a large attack threatening against these communities that I know have provided a lot of inspiration for many of the people in this room.
You're speaking of Oaxaca now.
Oaxaca, but even now in Chiapas, there is an increase.
In Chiapas, yeah.
Have you heard of this, or do you know, what can you comment on how we could?
I actually have friends down there, yeah. Actually, I was just, happened to just be on a documentary. I spoke to a group of activists in Oaxaca recently at a meeting, so yeah, I've been following. I don't know exactly what's going on in Chiapas, but in Oaxaca, yeah, it's been pretty miserable and brutal. The Mexican police are extremely brutal. When they're supported by the United States, there's no bounds. And what's happened in Oaxaca is pretty awful. Chiapas, I'm not sure, but probably will come. But I don't know if you had a question. But
I just was wondering if you had heard about the increased pressure that they're facing, and unfortunately they feel very abandoned by the international community currently, the Zapatistas specifically in the EDL.
Well, they're abandoned because it's not reported. I mean, in fact, the Zapatistas survived only because they made very imaginative use of media, like the internet. So they were able to garner public support, which restricted the capacity of the federales, the Mexican army and police, or basically terrorists. They restricted their ability with U.S. backing to just crush them. I mean, materially they could have done it, but with a tremendous amount of international support, they had to back off. That happens over and over. International solidarity makes a huge difference. Just to take another example, which is pretty stunning, in Bolivia, which is a remarkable situation, in December 2005, they had the most democratic election I've ever heard of. Certainly, totally different from the charade that's going on here. There was literally. It's a serious point, and we should think about it. I mean, I don't have to talk about what's going on here, you know very well. In Bolivia, the overwhelming majority of the population, which happens to be indigenous, for the first time in 500 years, entered the political arena and succeeded in electing somebody from their own ranks with issues that everybody knew about and that were extremely important. The election wasn't based on whether one of the candidates shed a tear or another one looks you straight in the eye or whatever it may be. The election was fought on issues like cultural rights, like taking control of your own resources. I mean, things that really matter to people, issues that don't even enter the discussion here. And they elected a poor peasant from their own ranks. That doesn't happen. This kind of election doesn't take place in the West, but it took place. And Morales, who basically is a representative of the people, it's not, it's not rule from above, is proceeding with those demands. He's bitterly condemned in the West as authoritarian or dictatorial because he's following the wishes of about 90% of the population, as, for example, when they moved towards nationalization of oil. Bitterly condemned here as authoritarian and dictatorial, failing to mention that, yeah, practically everybody supported it. Going back to the solidarity, in Bolivia, they didn't just go to the polls on election day and push a button like we're supposed to do. This is a constant struggle. The people who took part in winning the election had been struggling about this for years. And struggling, I mean, like Oaxaca, getting killed by the military and police and so on, over real issues. The main one was in Cochabamba, where they were, the previous government, was following the instructions of the World Bank, and the United States lies behind it, to privatize water. Well, you take an economics course, you may learn a theorem which says that it's good to privatize water because it does lots of wonderful things. And then there's what in economics is called an externality, something we don't consider because it sort of messes up the model. The externality in this case is that people can't afford to buy it, so they starve, but that's somebody else's business. Abstractly, in some abstract world, it turns out that this works better. Well, the peasants of Cochabamba didn't accept it, and they struggled against it, and they succeeded in driving Bechtel out of the country. It's better than we did here when Bechtel was robbing us blind on the Big Dig. It'll have to be rebuilt in a couple of years. They drove him out, and solidarity made a big difference. It happened that struggle in Cochabamba was peaking at the time of a meeting of the regional groups of the World Social Forum in Washington. There was big demonstrations about the IMF and the World Bank, happened to be at the same time. And again, with clever use of the internet, activists in Bolivia were able to activate protests in Washington, in Seattle, in California, where Bechtel is located, in London, all over the place, protests against the bank and the corporations, and they drove them out. And that's part of important part of the move towards the elections that took place in Bolivia. So solidarity not only can make a big difference, it can save people from destruction. I mean, if you take a look at the balance of military forces, I mean, if that's all that mattered, it's obvious what would happen in the world. Nazism would look gentle. What prevents it is popular engagement to prevent predatory and violent institutions, states and private, from doing what they want. And the same was true in Chiapas, and it ought to be true in Oaxaca, but unfortunately it isn't because people don't know about it.
I'm giving a presentation next. My name is Carl Kurtz. And Bison Bombs was founded at the time of the Reagan era. And recently in the media, this icon of the past has risen again, and he's lauded to by the Republicans who hold debates in the Reagan Library, as well as the Democrats. And the remaking of this ethical conservative is really repugnant to me. I wish that you could comment on this and give us a little historical background of what to expect from the Reagan doctrine.
Back off a little bit from the microphone.
Sorry.
I didn't catch everything. If you get close to the microphone, I can't hear.
Got it. My question or my request is for, can you hear me? My request is that you elaborate on the remaking of the image of Ronald Reagan.
Oh yeah, that's interesting.
And the history coming forward today. Bison Bombs was sort of born at this time of the Reagan doctrine.
Yeah, Bison Bombs I think is 1984. Correct? 1984.
Yes.
In 1984 was an important year in Nicaragua. They had a democratic election, a free democratic election, very carefully monitored. International monitors, British parliamentary human rights inquiry, Irish government parliamentary inquiry, the Dutch government, which was very hostile to the Sandinistas, had an official inquiry. The Latin American Studies Association is a professional group of Latin American scholars that not only went to monitor the election, but they sent specialists who'd done field work in Nicaragua there for several weeks beforehand. They all reached the same conclusion. It was a very free and fair election. The Sandinistas won the election. Okay, they are UN people, remember. So the position of the U.S. government was the election didn't take place. And approximately 100% of the media took the same position. In fact, they staged a way of trying to drive the election off the front pages. They staged a delivery, an alleged delivery of MiGs, Russian MiGs, to Nicaragua right at the time of the election. And of course, front pages are Russians delivering MiGs to Nicaragua, threat to the United States. In fact, not long after, Reagan declared a national emergency because of the threat to the security of the United States posed by the government of Nicaragua, which, remember, was only 2 days away from Harlem, Texas, and they were just about to be destroyed by these hordes. And the media went along, and commentary went along. I mean, some were skeptical. They said, well, maybe, like our senator, Osama, the liberal senator, they said, well, maybe they really aren't sending MiGs. But if they are, we got to bomb them. Because obviously we can't allow MiGs to be in a country like Nicaragua, which could destroy us if they try. Okay, I took care of the election. Incidentally, why would Nicaragua want MiGs? Of course, it's all fraud, but why might they have wanted MiGs? This really shows us something about the imperial mentality. I mean, inconceivable reason. In fact, Nicaragua had requested jet planes from France, but the U.S. barred that. They did not want Nicaragua to have planes from a Western ally. They wanted them to get them from Russia. That's an old trick. That's the way they overthrew the government of Guatemala. Force them, threaten them with an attack, try to get them to defend themselves, block any help from your allies, compel them to go to your enemies, then present them as a threat to our existence. I mean, if somebody's watching this from Mars, they think the country's insane. How could Nicaragua be 2 days from Harlem, Texas? But, it sells here among educated people. Anyway, in fact, they did need airplanes, namely to protect their airspace. The U.S. had total control of their airspace. It was using it to support the contras, the mercenary forces that were using to carry out terror in Nicaragua, which were most not like ordinary guerrillas. I mean, they had computers, they had planes up in the CIA planes, which were sending signals telling them where the Nicaraguan army was so that they could attack soft targets, undefended civilian targets, actually official policy. So yeah, they wanted to protect their airspace, but they knew that they better not get jet planes if the United States looked over search. Anyway, that did knock the election off the front pages. Everything you read says the first election was in 1990. That one was okay because after battering the country in the dust to people and threatening them with worse, the people more or less gave up and voted for the U.S. candidate. So that was okay, a real election. That's another illustration of the real hatred of democracy among elite circles. It's really, it's almost passion. And it takes genius not to perceive it. So that's what happened in 1984. What about Reagan? Reagan was a brutal thug and coward. It was just a disgrace. I mean, there are now books coming out by liberal historians saying, well, it wasn't as honest we thought, he really knew what was going on, he's a good guy. They don't understand that by saying that he knew what was going on, that's the worst condemnation you can make of it. I mean, you could sort of say, okay, maybe he's a nice guy, didn't know what the heck was happening, so it's not so awful. But if he actually knew what was going on and had any role in planning it, then he's a major criminal. And in fact, he was not a popular president. You take a look back at the polls through the 80s, there's nothing sort of normal popularity, nothing special. After he was out of office, and especially there was a huge propaganda campaign developed to deify him. You remember, I'm sure, the when he died, that performance in Washington, it was like Kim Il-sung. It was an embarrassment to the country. But he was turned into some kind of great, the great genius. Stalin, Kim Il-sung was an example of Kim Il-sungism. And yeah, he was made into kind of an icon. People have probably not forgotten what he was, or how much, the actual attitudes were towards him. So yes, he's up on some pantheon. And every Republican candidate has to say, I'm the new Ronald Reagan. In fact, Barack Obama the other day praised Reagan as somebody who had brought about change. Brought about change. He changed millions of people into corpses, for example. But he also the most compassionate president in post-war American history. Otherwise, the whole country would have been brought up by Japan in those years. That's Ronald Reagan. And the creation of the deity, it was astonishing. I mean, in a way, it's what they did with Petraeus on September 11th. This divine creature, can't say a word against him. It's the PR industry, public relations industry, is very sophisticated. I mean, they know what they're doing. And in fact, they were, for history, it was founded in the First World War. And it was imitated by Hitler, openly, publicly. They said we're going to use the techniques of American commercial advertising to turn this country, and they did. They turned the most civilized country in the world into the worst barbarians in history, using the kinds of commercial advertising that were developed primarily here.
A little bit about, the confluence of interests here, the Israel lobby, major media outlets, putting forward this agenda for, Israel, Halliburton, and whoever else.
Well, first of all, I should say that the individual reporters often do extremely good work, very courageous and honorable work. It's been very hard to do in Iraq. The reason it's been hard to do in Iraq is it's such a total catastrophe that reporters can't go into the field. They are stuck mostly in the green zone, or else they are out surrounded by, Reagan's tanks or something. This first war ever that was, I think it was so, the catastrophe was so hideous that the reporters just couldn't get out from protection. You can't blame them for that. And there are reporters who've done really good, serious work. The question is, what happens when it gets shaped and designed and selected to turn into what we read? Okay, then it ends up being like what I described. And maybe a lot of the reporters have also internalized those values. They come from the educated classes too, so they've internalized pretty much the same values. If you want to find out what's going on in the world, if I had one newspaper in the world that I was allowed to read, I'd pick the New York Times. In the world, that's the newspaper from which you can get the most information. You have to do a lot of decoding. You have to remember to start with the last paragraph. Headlines, you have to remember what was said yesterday, and that sort of thing. But if you pay attention, you can learn a lot about the world. On the other hand, the end result is this. The real problem, I think, is not false reporting, but it's rather the imperial mentality, the kind that I described, which just doesn't see things. It doesn't see, for example, that when you say Iran is defying the whole world by taking the position that's supported by the majority of the world, that there's something wrong somewhere. Until you get to see that, you can't do honest journalism. And the same with every other case. As far as the Israel lobby is concerned, well, first of all, in the case of Iraq, Israel was not particularly in favor of the invasion of Iraq. In fact, they thought it was a diversion from what they really wanted. They wanted a U.S. attack against Iran. Iraq, nobody feared. Even Kuwait, which was invaded by Iraq, didn't fear it. The United States is the only country in the world where people not only hated Saddam Hussein, people were afraid of it after a huge media campaign. So Israel knew that it's not a military threat. In fact, in a way, it's kind of defense for Israel against Iran, which is a big, powerful country that they can't control. It's the only country in the region that they can't dominate. So they didn't like the invasion of Iraq particularly. And if you look over the record, you'll find that the Israel lobby began speaking up for the invasion of Iraq after they knew that Washington was going to do it. Now, once Washington pretty much announced early 2002 we were going after Iraq, then of course they joined in and said, yes, we've got to go after Iraq. But that's, that's not the tail wagging the dog, it's the tail following the dog. In general, the Israel lobby is an important lobby, but you have to be careful exactly what you mean by it. So take a look at this book by Walton Mearsheimer, sort of standard book on the Israel lobby. They begin by defining the lobby in a proper way. They define the lobby the people who commit themselves to supporting the policies of the state of Israel, essentially no matter what. Okay, and that's a good definition of the lobby. But who's a member of the lobby? I mean, like the New York Times, or Boston Globe, Harvard University. The whole intellectual class is a member of the lobby by that definition, and not forever. You can time it. It's after 1967. Before 1967, there wasn't really much interest in Israel. Even the Holocaust everything blew up a huge issue after the Israeli victory in 1967. But that Israeli victory in 1967 performed an enormous service to the United States. It eliminated secular Arab nationalism and placed the U.S. client, Saudi Arabia, the leader of radical Islamic fundamentalism. It secured their dominance of the region. There was a war going on between secular Arab nationalism, represented by Nasser, and radical Islamic fundamentalism, which in most extreme cases Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. was on the Saudi side, on the fundamentalist side, as it typically has been. And the secular nationalism was considered a threat to U.S. control of the energy resources. Well, Israel put paid to that. They also knocked one of the crops out from the non-aligned movement, which the U.S. hated. So they performed a major service to the United States. That's when the relations between the U.S. and Israel got really tight, strong relations, and the intellectual class went along. They started loving it. They went into a love affair with Israel, but not before. So is that part of the Israel lobby? It's hard to know what we mean by this.
Well, the book that came out was, have you read the book that just came out?
The Walter Mearsheimer. The Walter Mearsheimer book. Yeah, I read it.
Basically, they say that the Israel lobby is like a gun lobby or any of these other lobbies, but it's a very powerful lobby.
Yeah, it is.
And that nobody dares to say anything in the present political climate anti-Israel, because otherwise they're going to fund their enemies. And it's a kind of so
Look, it's something
to cross the line and Norman Connors will be Norman. I can't.
I'm sorry, our title Professor Chomsky is really taken away against a lot of people.
Norman Connors is a very good example of the Israel lobby. Okay, and let's just take a look. I mean, I know that Noam Chomsky was the commentary, an ultra-right-winger, super pro-Zionist fanatic. Up until 1967, he didn't care about Israel. You want to find out more about that? Read his book. He had a book called Making It, about how great he was, which came out in early 1967, before the 67 war. There's barely a mention of Israel in it. The Commentary magazine, she became the editor of, it was actually non-Zionist in the 50s. It became moderately pro-Israel in the early 60s. It was nothing much until after 67. Now, if by the Israel lobby you mean the intellectual class which went along with state power, as they usually do, oh yeah, they're hard to combat on any topic. If you mean AIPAC, it's almost a registered lobby of the foreign government, they're influential too. Like they bribe congressmen, people in Congress. And then if you look closely, the effect that they have on Congress, which has been incidentally analyzed very closely by Stephen Zunes, a very good Middle East scholar. You can find his stuff on the internet. It's a funny sort of an influence. I mean, on an issue where nothing is going to happen, where they know there's no outcome, people in Congress will vote the way AIPAC wants them to, because they pick up some money and some prestige, and nothing's going to happen anyway, so they'll vote that Jerusalem should be the capital or something, and then it doesn't get implemented. And they have some effect. I mean, all kinds of lobbies have effects. Like, take, say, the Armenian lobby. I mean, they practically drove the United States into a major confrontation with one of its chief allies a couple of months ago, right here in Boston. Yeah, lobbies have influences. And the official Israel lobby that has more than most, I mean, obviously it doesn't even begin to compare with the Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable. Right? I mean, it's not at all in the same league, but as a lobby, it has significance. In fact, one question you might have people who believe in the power of the lobby might ask themselves is, suppose you believe that this is true, suppose you believe that the Israel lobby really runs everything and you can't say anything against it. Well, what are the tactical consequences of that belief? Actually, there are tactical consequences. Tactical consequences are these. People like me, you ought to stop wasting their time giving talks on Israel-Palestine, writing books about it, and trying to get information out. It's all a waste of time because they'll just shut everybody up. What we ought to be doing is putting on our ties and jackets, going to the corporate headquarters of Lockheed Martin, Intel, ExxonMobil, Warren Buffett, Chase Manhattan, and so on, and explain to them patiently that their interests are being harmed by a lobby that they can put out of business in 30 seconds with their political and economic clout. That's the tactical consequence. Does anybody do it? No, of course not. This is totally crazy. They don't think their interests are being harmed. They think this is fine. That's why Intel invests in Israel. That's why Warren Buffett invests there. Lockheed Martin thinks it's terrific. Well, if the main centers of American capitalism think they're doing great, what's the effect of the lobby? How are they harming what's called the national interest? I mean, there is something to the story. And the book is a valuable book. Mearsheimer has a lot of data in it. But it just doesn't pan out for sort of elementary reasons.
There are 2 to 3 important resources of information. You mentioned the New York Times is one of them, once you dissect and do all the necessary operations to get that information. But something that people can walk away with and refer to when an issue comes up, rather than waiting a year later for reports to come out and information to be reviewed through different government bodies or what have you, that people can refer to. And I guess my second question is just, what are your thoughts on President Carter, his involvement, or his opinions about Israel as well?
So, opinion on the Israel-Palestine?
Yes.
Well, when I get home tonight, I'm going to spend 5 or 6 hours answering the email that came today, which is very nice. And a substantial number of those letters are going to be your first question. And it's very frustrating because there's never an answer. There is no simple way of finding out what's going on in the world. It takes work. You got to read the national press, you have to read major journals, documentary sources. You want to find out about Oaxaca, you're going to use, as we mentioned over there, you're just going to have to make a much deeper inquiry. You want to find out about the things I talked about, say North Korea. Well, I could give you the sources that are just using, it's the main scholarly work, but it's work. There is no simple way to break through the clouds of propaganda and distortion. You have to work on it. In fact, that's why popular movements are so important, like Blacks on Bombs. And it's why the peasants of Bolivia were able to achieve what they did. And why the people of Chiapas were, or why unions are so important. When people come together, they can achieve, they escalate radically what any one of them can do. The same's true in the sciences. I mean, if people had to work alone, say, or at work, they wouldn't get to work. You talk to others, you interchange ideas, you have thoughts, and that's the way understanding develops. One of the grand achievements of American propaganda has been to atomize the society. So everybody's alone. It's kind of like you and the two. Well, that way it's very hard to break out of anything. One of the reasons why there's such hatred for unions and such efforts to destroy them is that they were one of the main techniques by which poor working people could not only preserve protected rights, but get together to be able to think, to plan, to organize, to institute programs, maybe to achieve the kind of things that peasants in Bolivia did. And there's just no way out of this. If you sit alone, it's a major research project every time anything comes up. There is no general answer. As far as President Carter and there's a lot you can do, especially with the internet, which sort of. As far as President Carter is concerned, his book was a good book. And for people who knew about the topic, there was nothing new in it. It was kind of old hat. But for the United States, it was revolutionary. Because most of what he described ran very much counter to the standard doctrines. Actually, there were, the book actually had one serious error. The book was bitterly attacked, as you know. Everybody's trying to find mistakes in it. People like Alan Dershowitz of Harvard probably tantrums. But there was, in fact, one serious error in the book, which no one ever mentioned. And there was one very important revelation in the book, which people never mentioned. The rest was sort of pretty familiar. The error was his statement that the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, which killed about 20,000 people and destroyed much of Lebanon, was undertaken because of a reaction to Palestinian attacks on in the northern Galilee from Lebanon. And that was the propaganda line. It was a complete fraud. I mean, so much so that anybody minimally knowledgeable wouldn't even laugh at it. The word was quiet except for Israeli efforts to invoke some kind of violence as a pretext for the attack. So that was the one serious error in the book. But of course that's not mentioned. I don't have to say why. There was one important revelation in the book. Again, not a revelation to activists, but a revelation to the public. I don't think it ever appeared anywhere. That had to do with the famous roadmap for peace in the region, which you keep reading about. What Carter pointed out, and he's absolutely right, is that Israel instantly rejected the roadmap with U.S. support. The way they did it is the usual way. They accepted it and added 14 reservations, which completely undercut it, and the U.S. backed them up. So, end of the roadmap. And Carter wrote about that, and he actually has an appendix in the book in which he lists the reservations. Well, in all the huge screeching about Carter, I never saw this mentioned. But take a look, that's the most important part of the book. And he gave an accurate, pre-accurate description of what's happening in the occupied territories. It wouldn't be new, going back to the first question about sources. If you want to know about what's going on there, just read the English translations in the Israeli press, which you can find on the internet. They give you a detailed account of what's going on there. Anyone who knows that material wouldn't be surprised by what he said, but here it was surprising. So, it was an important contribution, and he could almost estimate how important it is by the virulence of the attack.
About how the U.S. occupation has increased in sectarian violence and war.
I'm not hearing you.
Can you talk about how the U.S. occupation has increased in sectarian violence in Iraq and the increase in the warlords? Could you talk about the effect that's had on women in Iraq, on the violence against women, on the murders, with the imposition of fundamental Sharia law? And secondly, if you could address, I don't know if you have any suggestions on this, on how we in the anti-war movement can address, this human rights issue of the violence against women in Iraq.
It's terrible. And in fact, it's even making the newspapers. You read reports the situation in Iraq, which is it's much worse than what Saddam Hussein. I don't even have to go through the details, which you can actually find in the press. Yes, there being one of the effects of the U.S. invasion, and remember, Nuremberg, that's part of the accumulated evil of the initial aggression. Iraqis understand that. They blame the United States for everything that's happened, accepting the Nuremberg principles. We can't bring ourselves to do that, but we should. Part of it is the horrible treatment of women. They're being driven back into the constraints of the tribal societies, which are just indescribably awful, from dress to behavior to opportunities to violent attacks and so on. Same thing's happening in Afghanistan. If you read, one of the things is Afghanistan, that was supposed to be called a success story, we have not, the U.S. after 6 years, has not been able to establish more than a fraction of the electrical power that was available under the Russians. And women in Kabul now have to worry about things that they didn't worry about under the Russian occupation when they were pretty liberated. They did have to worry about things then too, going back to Reagan. They had to worry about Reagan's favorite, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who got his kicks out of throwing acid in the face of women who weren't properly dressed by standards of the U.S.-backed Islamic terrorists. But now it's going back to that. The liberation that did exist has been, it was worse under the Taliban, but under the Russian occupation it wasn't that bad, especially for educated men. And it's going back to this kind of tribalism. Not everywhere. They're very, if you want to find out about this, the best place to look is RAW. I forget what it stands for, but it's an old organization that has been defending Afghan women for years. You can find them on the internet, they give pretty regular accounts of this. But yes, it's extremely bad. And the rise, the same in Pakistan. Pakistan was driven towards radical Islamism primarily during the 1980s. It's another one of Reagan's achievements. The dictator of Pakistan, AIPAC, is the one who introduced the Saudi-funded radical Islamic madrasas, which, you study the Quran and you bring out the most repressive elements of Sharia and so on. It's kind of a Saudi version of Islam. It's very harsh towards women. And that was introduced in Pakistan in the 80s with U.S. support, Reagan support. That's had a big effect on society. It's very much harmed women. The way to deal with this is just simply to educate people. For example, one place you can start is with the writings of in Afghanistan in the 80s, in the late 80s, there was a UN representative responsible for the rights of women, a very well-known international feminist activist, Rasil Basri, who was one of the organizers of the international, the UN programs on women's rights and so on. She happened to be a UN representative there in the late 80s. And she wrote a couple of articles about it, which the Western press refused to publish. In fact, even this magazine refused to publish them because they were sort of favorable to what was happening. But that's an independent picture from a very knowledgeable observer of some of the opportunities that were available to women, which are not gone. And that and Roa and other sources have plenty more. So yes, it's just like the women's movement already that began with consciousness raising, education, like every other movement, and that's what has to be done.
So I'm sorry, we promised we'd get Professor Chomsky out the door 5 minutes ago. So I would like to thank him again for his presentation.